So it's a good idea if we refresh our memories and really try to understand the death of Umar radiallahu anhu and his assassination, and how blessed his death actually was as one of those beloved companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Umar radiallahu anhu, now we want to just backtrack a little bit. Umar radiallahu anhu, during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was actually on a journey. Him and a few other companions, and the Prophet was at the fore. The Prophet was at the front. So Umar was riding his conveyance, and he had another companion, Uthman ibn Mad'un. He was actually the gatekeeper. He was the one that had the key to the Kaaba. So they were both traversing a mountain path, and Umar radiallahu anhu cut him off with his conveyance. Like you'd be driving today, and then someone pulls up in front of you. So I don't know, you might stick up a finger, you might start swearing at him. So Uthman radiallahu anhu, Uthman ibn Mad'un radiallahu anhu, he looked at Umar, gave him a dirty look, and he said, "Awja'tani ya ghalaq al-fitna." He said, "Oh Umar, you just caused me some inconvenience. Watch where you're going." He called him by a very unusual title, ghalaq al-fitna, which means the blockade to trials, the door which prevents any tribulation or adversity from coming into the Muslim ranks. So Umar radiallahu anhu, he was sat there scratching his head thinking, I've never heard anybody call me this title before. So when the caravan stopped, then he approached Uthman ibn Mad'un and asked him, "You called me a really strange, unusual name, ghalaqul fitna, the blockade, the barricade to trials and adversities. Where did you get that from?" So Uthman ibn Mad'un said, "We were sat with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam one day, just casually talking and merrymaking, and you happened to walk past. Now when you walked past, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam pointed at you and he said, "Hadha ghalaqul fitna." This is, meaning Umar radiallahu anhu, he's the blockade, he's the barricade to adversities. And the Prophet said, as long as he's amongst you, as long as Umar radiallahu anhu is still alive, then you'll be saved from adversities and turbulence and trials and all sorts of disadvantages which could possibly affect the Muslims. And as soon as he passes away, then the floodgates will be open and all sorts of trials will now befall the Muslims. So Umar radiallahu anhu was known as the ghalaqul fitna. He was then conversing one day with Hudhayfa radiallahu anhu. And Hudhayfa radiallahu anhu, he was a young companion. He was known as Sahibu Sirri Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He was the secret bearer of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He was the Prophet's close confidant. So any secrets that the Prophet wanted to entrust to anybody, he'd give it to Hudhayfa radiallahu anhu. That's why when it comes to what we call eschatology, meaning the end of times and the minor and the major signs of the Day of Judgment, all of the reports that have come down to us have come through Hudhayfa radiallahu anhu, because the Prophet would specifically call him over and then he would convey all of these pieces of information, secret pieces of information to him that needed to be deciphered or they were encrypted. So he was talking with Hudhayfa radiallahu anhu, and Umar said to him, "Tell me about the trials and the tribulations that will affect the Muslims." So Hudhayfa radiallahu anhu said, "You don't need to worry about it. You, Umar radiallahu anhu, don't worry about it, don't sweat over it." So Umar said, "Why is that? I mean, surely I'm in the same boat as everybody else. I'm a believer, I'm a follower of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so surely I'll have to then face and encounter all of these different adversities that everybody else has to." So Hudhayfa radiallahu anhu said, "You don't need to worry, because between you and between the adversities, there's a door, there's a gate, there's a barricade. And as long as that barricade remains upright and is still erected, then nothing will affect the Muslims." So Umar radiallahu anhu, he said, "Ayuksaru hadha al-bab am yuftah?" He said, okay, so obviously the door will have to be opened, will have to be then opened up one day. So Umar radiallahu anhu asked, will that door be opened, meaning gently, peacefully, or will it be broken down, will it be breached? So Hudhayfa radiallahu anhu said, no, it will be breached. Bal yuksar. And this information comes from the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So Hudhayfa's companions who were with him when he narrated the incident said, we were too scared to ask him, who is this door? Who is this barricade who will blockade the Muslims from all these trials? One of his companions, one of Hudhayfa's companions, managed to muster up the courage and boldly asked him, did Umar radiallahu anhu know who you were talking about? Did Umar radiallahu anhu know who this ghalaqul fitna was? Hudhayfa said, definitely, most definitely. I knew, and Umar radiallahu anhu knew, that this ghalaqul fitna was none other than himself. So Umar radiallahu anhu was the one who prevented all sorts of adversities and turbulence from creeping into the Muslim ranks. The Prophet ﷺ, during his own lifetime, he actually foretold and prophesied of Umar radiallahu anhu's martyrdom. One day the Prophet ﷺ, and again look, he was accompanied by Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman, so his three most trusted companions. They were all stood on Mount Uhud one day, which is just outside of Medina. and the mountain all of a sudden started to tremble and started to shake. So the Prophet ﷺ, Allah had given him some command over the earthly beings. So the Prophet ﷺ then stamped his foot down on the ground on top of the mountain and said, "Uthbut ya Uhud." The Prophet spoke to the mountain and said, "Uhud, just calm down and stop shaking, stop trembling, because standing upon you is a prophet and a Siddiq, meaning someone who is of the highest level of truth, the most truthful person, meaning Abu Bakr, and Shahidan, and 2 martyrs, meaning Umar and Uthman radiallahu anhu." So they knew from the time of the Prophet that their end will be met with martyrdom. Now Umar radiallahu anhu, he was the caliph of the Muslim Empire for 10 years, from the year 634 to 644. And the territorial gains and the expansion which took place under his rule was never seen after that. Maybe during the Umayyad rule, 30, 40 years later, but he was a pioneer of Muslim expansion. He managed to conquer lands like Iran and Iraq, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Egypt as well, parts of North Africa. So he was a strong military commander and strategist. But during his 10 years, if you actually read his biography, what's interesting to note is he only left his caliphal capital of Medina only a handful of times. Whereas him being the commander, it would have been befitting for him to lead his troops from the front, which is what he would have liked to have done. But he stated himself, he clearly mentioned explicitly the reason why he wanted to stay in Medina. He had a wish. Umar radiallahu anhu had a wish. And he would always make one specific supplication. He'd always say, "Allahumma arzuqni shahadatan fi sabilik, waj'al mawti fi baladi rasulik." And these are like two diametrically opposed concepts. He would always supplicate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala 2 things. "Oh Allah, grant me martyrdom in your path," meaning on the battlefield. And number 2, grant me a blessed death in this city of your Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the reason why that was always quite perplexing and surprising is because martyrdom is achieved on the battlefield. And Medina, being the capital of the Muslim Empire, was far removed from the Muslim frontiers. So people always used to scratch their heads thinking, you want to be a martyr, but you don't want to leave Medina. So how is that even possible? It was completely incomprehensible that an army would attack Medina, because it was just a suicide mission. Why would you attack the main capital? So everybody always used to scratch their heads, but Umar carried on making dua. So many times he'd extend the pulpit. One occasion he ascended the pulpit and he said that the Prophet ﷺ explained to me that there's a palace in Jannah. There's a palace in paradise, and it has 500 doors, meaning it's going to be a huge mansion-like palace. And behind each door will be 500 damsels. And then he turned to the grave of the Prophet ﷺ, which was actually situated just inside the mosque, or just behind the wall, in the Prophet's private quarters. He looked towards the grave of the Prophet and he said that, "I'm sure that you're going to be the recipient of this palace." And then he turned to Abu Bakr, who was lying beside the Prophet ﷺ, and said that, "I'm also sure that you're also going to be a recipient of this magnificent, splendid palace." And then he spoke to himself whilst he was addressing the people like I am today. And he said, "What about you, O Umar? What about you?" He said, "The third person who will be a recipient of this palace will be a martyr." And then he's speaking to himself. Everybody's still listening. They thought he was losing his mind. He said, "Don't worry, Umar. The same Allah, the same Lord that brought you from Mecca to Medina when you migrated with the Prophet is the same Lord who will bring martyrdom right to your footstep, right to your doorstep here in Medina." So one thing we learn, an important lesson, is whatever dreams you have, whatever aspirations you have, pursue them, but at the same time always implore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Always supplicate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no matter how far-fetched it seemed. Now imagine Umar radiallahu anhu. It was impossible, damn near impossible, for him to attain martyrdom in Medina. It was just unheard of. But he carried on making dua. He supplicated, even though people said he was crazy, even though people just brushed it aside saying it was improbable. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still managed to manifest his dreams. So make sure after every single salah, after every single prayer, raise your hands and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it doesn't even have to be anything which is completely wholly religious. Whatever you might have, whatever struggles you might be going through, any promotion you might be chasing at work, any exams you might be then foreseeing in the future, just raise your hands and make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So very quickly, just to wrap up here. So Umar radiallahu anhu, a few days before his martyrdom, he was approached by a slave. He was approached by a Persian slave. Persian people are the ethnic indigenous people of Iran, modern day Iran, which is under the rule of the Persian Sassanid Empire for 1,000 years. So his name was Abu Lu'lu' al-Majusi. Al-Majusi meaning he was a Zoroastrian. So that was the native, that was the regional religion of the Persians, Zoroastrianism. So Abu Lu'lu' al-Majusi came to the Caliph Umar radiallahu anh with a complaint. Now look at how Umar radiallahu anh, now imagine we have a problem with our bills and Boris Johnson leaves his doors open, well not Boris Johnson, whoever's going to be the next one. He leaves his door open and he says, anybody who wants to come, you've got free counselling sessions, one-to-one, come and present your complaints before me. Imagine, we would say that is a true leader. That's the hallmark of a true leader. This was Umar radiallahu anh. He was in charge of an empire which spanned from the east, meaning Afghanistan and Iran, all the way to the western lands like Egypt, North Africa, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and still he made time to accommodate for people's needs and for people's complaints. So a slave, a Persian slave, came to him and said, my master said that I can work for him every single day. He's given me permission to go to the markets and to earn a living, but he wants 4 silver coins from me every single day. Now I think that's a bit too pricey, and I don't think I'll be able to pay for that. So Umar said, okay, fair enough. What's your daily occupation? What do you do as your job? He said, I make hand mills. So I'm a craftsman and I make hand mills. So Umar radiallahu anh called for his accountant and he made a few calculations and he was seeing how much a hand mill would cost to make and how much it could be sold for in the market. And it turned out actually that the master asking for a meager price of 4 silver coins was actually quite reasonable. So Umar said to him, look, I've done the calculations, 4 silver coins seems to be reasonable. So I don't think you have any complaint here. Your complaint has now been brushed aside, it's been dealt with, so you can return back to your master. Now Abu Lu'lu' wasn't happy about this. He wasn't happy about this. So he said to Umar radiallahu anh, after Umar asked him, Umar radiallahu anh asked him, can you make a special hand mill for me? I'll pay you whatever you want. Abu Lu'lu' said, quite sarcastically, he said, you know what, I'm going to make a very special hand mill for you, one of a kind, bespoke made, with quite a sarcastic tone. So Ali radiallahu anh was actually sat there next to him. So Ali radiallahu anh said, oh Amirul Mu'mineen, commander of the believers, I think that's a threat. That's quite a sarcastic tone he's got on there, and I think he's made a threat against your life. Umar said, don't worry. If Allah's on my side, Allah will protect me. If Allah wants me to achieve martyrdom, then He will do. So it became the talk of the town. Now Abu Lu'lu' has a vendetta against Umar radiallahu anh. So 3 days later, at the time of Fajr Salah, Umar radiallahu anh walked into Al-Masjid al-Nabawi, the mosque of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he assumed his position on the Prophet's prayer mat, where the Prophet used to lead Salah, where Abu Bakr led Salah before him, and he started his Salah. One row behind him was Amr ibn Maymun radiallahu anh. He was a young companion, and he said, between me and Umar radiallahu anh was just one companion, Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu. Now, they didn't have microphones or PA speaker system back in those days, so the people who were in the closest vicinity to the Imam would be able to hear everything. So Amr ibn Maymun said, I was praying Salah, Umar said, Allahu Akbar. And next thing you know, Umar started shrieking and screaming and crying and said, I've just been murdered, shouting. So all the people in the front few rows could hear this commotion. They couldn't really see what was going on because it was quite dark. The people in the back rows, now they heard Umar say Allahu Akbar Takbir, and that's it. The sound now cut off. So they were worrying, what's happened to Umar? Is something wrong? Has he collapsed? What's going on at the front? So they started shouting out Subhanallah, Subhanallah, to try and prompt the Imam that we can't hear you. So Umar radiallahu anh collapsed to the ground. A few companions lifted him up, took him to the side. As they were carrying him to the side, they realized that Abu Lu'lu' al-Majusi, the same Zoroastrian Persian from a few days ago who threatened Umar radiallahu anh, he had a two-sided dagger in his hands with poison tips on either side. So he'd stabbed Umar radiallahu anh, and on his way out, he then, with his slashing motion, then went through the front few rows as well. He injured around 20 companions, he even killed 7 of them. Then one companion in the back, a brave companion, took off his topi and threw it at his face. He was disorientated and he became a little bamboozled, and he dropped he took the hat off his face and he realized he was completely surrounded by companions, so he stabbed himself and committed suicide because he knew that if he ended up in the hands of the Muslims, then he'd be executed for sure. Now the commotion subsided. Umar radiallahu anh was taken to his quarters. Somebody came and finished off the salah. For the next 3 days, Umar radiallahu anh remained in a very pitiful state in his house. Whenever he'd drink any fluids, and one narration mentions he'd drink milk and it just comes straight out of his stomach because the wound penetrated so deep into his stomach. And 3 days later, Umar radiallahu anh ended up passing away. So to conclude, a few lessons we can learn from this. Number one is, look how his dua was accepted in the end by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No matter how improbable or impossible it may seem, supplicate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because you don't know the treasures, you don't know the command and the authority Allah possesses. You might wake up one day and all of your problems are gone. You might wake up one day and the world completely taken a 360 turn just for you. So always make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One final moment, when Umar radiallahu anhu was bedridden, then a few people came to visit him. Now one youngster came, and he was a young companion. He obviously wanted to meet the Prophet Umar radiallahu anhu. He came, met Umar radiallahu anhu and said, you've met an extremely enviable death. You were standing on the Prophet's space, where Abu Bakr and the Prophet ﷺ both led Salah. You passed away in Fajr Salah. You were stabbed in Fajr Salah, in the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ. How blessed a death have you met? So when he was walking back, this youngster, Umar radiallahu anh noticed that his garments and his trousers were hanging below his ankles. So he said to his son, Ibn Umar, call that young boy back. He called him back and he said, oh my beloved son, oh my beloved nephew, roll up your trousers and lift your garments above your ankles for two reasons. Because it's obviously cleaner for your garments. If they're trailing and accumulating dust, then it's obviously going to be dirty for your clothes, and it's more pleasing for your Lord Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even in his dying moments, in the throes and the pangs of death, he was still worried and concerned about not himself acting upon the sunnah, but others around him acting upon the sunnah. So let's try and inculcate these 2 points in our life. Make dua as much as possible for anything which may seem completely out of this world. And number 2, try and ensure that not just for prayer, but all the time, your trousers or your garments are above your ankles. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He inspires us with a true understanding of our Islamic history, and He gives us the true love of personalities and individuals like Umar radiallahu anhu. Ameen wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.